Jake Morrison had seen his share of bad deals, but a ranch for 50 cents seemed like the bargain of a lifetime. The weathered biker pulled his Harley up to the sagging fence line, studying the property he'd just bought sight unseen at a tax auction. The barn looked ready to collapse. Weeds had claimed the pastures, and the old farmhouse tilted like it was asking permission to fall down. He'd scraped together his last dollars for this gamble, hoping to find something, anything worth salvaging. But when he pushed open the barn door, his breath caught in his throat. There, in the shadows, stood the most magnificent horse he'd ever seen. Massive and proud, with eyes that seemed to hold decades of secrets. The animal wasn't wild or frightened. It simply watched him, as if it had been waiting. But how could a horse survive here alone? And why would someone abandon such a beautiful creature? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The silence stretched between them, man and beast, sizing each other up in the dim light, filtering through broken barn boards. Jake had been around horses as a kid, back when his grandfather still worked the family farm in Nebraska. That felt like a lifetime ago, before the military, before the years on the road, before everything fell apart. This horse was different from the gentle work animals he remembered. This one carried itself like royalty. "Easy there, big fella," Jake murmured, his voice rough from too many cigarettes and not enough conversation. The horse's ears flicked forward at the sound, but it didn't move. Jake took a cautious step closer, noting the animal's pristine condition. Its coat gleamed even in the poor light. Muscles rippled beneath skin that spoke of good care and regular exercise. Someone had been feeding this horse, and recently. Jake's weathered hands hung at his sides as he approached slowly. The horse was enormous, easily 17 hands high, with the powerful build of a thoroughbred, but the calm intelligence of a much older soul. When Jake was close enough to touch, the horse lowered its massive head and sniffed his outstretched palm. The breath was warm against his skin, and Jake felt something he hadn't experienced in years. "Peace. Where'd you come from, boy?" Jake whispered, running his fingers along the horse's velvet nose. The animal leaned into the touch, and Jake noticed something glinting from the stall post nearby. Hanging on a wooden peg was the most beautiful horse halter he'd ever seen. Rich leather, hand-tooled with intricate patterns, and studded with what looked like real silver. This wasn't barn equipment. This was artwork. Jake lifted the halter carefully, feeling the weight of quality craftsmanship in his hands. The leather was supple, well-oiled, and bore the kind of attention to detail that spoke of serious money. Whoever owned this horse hadn't just cared for it. They'd loved it. The sound of gravel crunching outside made both Jake and the horse turn toward the barn door. Jake's hand instinctively moved toward the knife on his belt, a habit from years when trust was a luxury he couldn't afford. But the footsteps were light, measured, not threatening. "Hello!" A woman's voice called from outside. "I saw the motorcycle. Is someone there?" Jake glanced at the horse, who seemed completely calm about the visitor. "In here," he called back, hanging the halter back on its peg. A woman appeared in the doorway, silhouetted against the afternoon sun. As she stepped inside, Jake could see she was probably in her 40s, with short auburn hair and the kind of practical clothes that spoke of someone who worked with her hands. She moved with confidence, but her eyes went immediately to the horse. "You found Thunder," she said, and there was relief in her voice. "Thunder?" Jake asked. "That his name?" "That's what Harold called him." She extended her hand toward Jake. "I'm Sarah Chen. I'm the veterinarian in town. I've been checking on him every few days since Harold disappeared." Jake shook her hand, noting the firm grip. "Jake Morrison, I bought this place at auction yesterday." 50 cents, Sarah's eyebrows rose. 50 cents? For the whole ranch? Tax auction. I figured even if the land was worthless, there might be something to salvage. Jake gestured around the barn. "Didn't expect to find him." Sarah moved toward Thunder with the easy confidence of someone who knew animals. The horse nickered softly and allowed her to run her hands along his neck, checking him over with professional thoroughness. "He looks good," she said, more to herself than to Jake. Someone's been caring for him. But Harold's been gone for 3 months now. 3 months. Jake frowned. Who's been feeding him? That's what I'd like to know. Sarah finished her examination and stepped back. Thunder's in perfect health. Someone's been giving him high-quality feed, exercise, grooming. This isn't a horse that's been abandoned. Jake felt a chill run down his spine that had nothing to do with the cool air in the barn. You think Harold's still around? I don't know what to think. Harold Whitman owned this place for 30 years. Raised thoroughbreds, showed them at state fairs. Thunder here was his pride and joy. Harold would never have left him behind voluntarily. What happened to Harold? Sarah's expression grew troubled. That's the mystery, isn't it? One day he was here, next day he was gone. Didn't tell anyone he was leaving, didn't take anything with him. Just vanished. The county put the place up for auction when the property taxes went unpaid. Jake walked over to examine the stall more closely. It was clean, fresh hay in the feeding trough, water bucket filled. Someone's definitely been here recently. I've been thinking the same thing every time I visit. Sarah pulled a business card from her pocket and handed it to Jake. Look, I don't know what your plans are for this place, but Thunder's a special horse. If you're thinking of selling him, or if you can't care for him properly, I know people who would give him a good home. Jake looked down at the card, then back at Thunder, who was watching their conversation with intelligent eyes. I wasn't planning on keeping a horse. I don't know the first thing about caring for one. It's not rocket science, but it is a commitment. Thunder's used to attention, quality care. He's not a pasture ornament. How much is a horse like this worth? Sarah was quiet for a moment, studying Thunder with the eye of someone who knew bloodlines and breeding. If I had to guess, based on his size, his condition, his obvious training, probably $30,000 to $40,000. Maybe more if his paperwork shows championship bloodlines. Jake nearly choked. 40,000? For a horse? Thunder's not just any horse. Look at him, really look. Sarah moved to Thunder's side, running her hand along his powerful shoulder. See how he carries himself. The muscle development? This is an animal that's been professionally trained and conditioned. Someone invested serious money in him. Jake stared at the horse with new eyes. Yesterday he'd been dead broke, sleeping in cheap motels and wondering where his next meal was coming from. Today, he owned a ranch and a horse worth more than most people's cars. There's something else, Sarah said, her voice dropping to almost a whisper. About a month ago, some men came around asking questions about Harold, about the property. They didn't look like police or family. They looked like business types, but the kind of business that makes people nervous. What kind of questions? About what Harold might have left behind, whether he'd hidden anything valuable on the property. The locals didn't much care for their attitude, so nobody told them much. But they seemed very interested in this ranch specifically. Jake felt the pieces of a puzzle falling into place, but he couldn't see the full picture yet. You think Harold was hiding something? I think Harold was a careful man who loved his privacy and his horses. But I also think there's more to his disappearance than anyone knows. Sarah gathered her veterinary bag and headed toward the door. Be careful, Jake. If you decide to stay here, keep your eyes open. As Sarah's truck disappeared down the gravel road, Jake found himself alone with Thunder again. The horse had moved to the stall door and was looking at him expectantly. Well, boy, Jake said, reaching out to stroke the horse's neck. Looks like we're stuck with each other for now. Thunder whinnied softly, as if he understood, and Jake couldn't shake the feeling that his 50-cent gamble had just become something much more complicated than he'd bargained for. The sun was setting as Jake made his way to the farmhouse, leaving Thunder with a promise to return in the morning. As he climbed the creaking porch steps, he noticed something that made him pause. The front door was slightly ajar, though he was certain he'd closed it when he'd first arrived. Jake pushed the door open carefully, his hand once again moving to his knife. The house was silent, but there was something in the air, a sense that someone had been there recently. Not the musty smell of abandonment, but the lingering traces of human presence. He flicked on the light switch and was surprised when the electricity actually worked. The living room was modest but comfortable, with furniture that had seen better days but was still solid. Family photos lined the mantelpiece, showing a man Jake assumed was Harold, with various horses over the years. Thunder appeared in several of the pictures, growing from a young colt to the magnificent stallion, now residing in the barn. Jake moved through the house methodically, checking each room. In the kitchen, he found evidence that someone had been here recently. A coffee cup in the sink, still slightly damp, breadcrumbs on the counter that hadn't had time to attract ants. The refrigerator hummed quietly, and when Jake opened it, he found it stocked with basic supplies. Milk that wouldn't expire for another week, fresh eggs, sandwich meat that smelled fine. Someone was definitely still using this house, and recently. But who and why? A sound from the barn made Jake freeze. A soft whinny, followed by what sounded like footsteps. Jake moved to the kitchen window and peered out into the growing darkness. He could see light moving around inside the barn, the beam of a flashlight dancing across the walls. Jake grabbed a baseball bat he'd spotted by the front door and made his way quietly across the yard. The barn door was open again, and he could hear someone moving around inside, speaking in low, soothing tones to Thunder. "Easy, boy. I know you missed me. I'm sorry I couldn't come yesterday." Jake stepped into the barn and found himself face to face with an elderly man in worn work clothes, carrying a bucket of feed. The man looked up at Jake with startled eyes, then his gaze moved to the baseball bat in Jake's hands. "You must be the fellow who bought the place," the old man said calmly. "I'm Harold Whitman." Jake lowered the baseball bat slowly, his mind racing. The man standing before him was probably in his 70s, with silver hair and the weathered hands of someone who'd spent a lifetime working with animals. Despite his age, he moved with the quiet confidence of a man comfortable in his own space. "Harold Whitman," Jake repeated. "The Harold Whitman who supposedly disappeared 3 months ago?" Harold set down the feed bucket and straightened, meeting Jake's eyes directly. "I didn't disappear. I went into hiding. There's a difference. Why? Because some things are worth more than money, and some people will kill for both." Harold moved toward Thunder, who nickered softly at his approach. "I heard you met Sarah today." "Good woman. She's been taking care of Thunder when I couldn't risk being seen." Jake studied the old man's face, looking for signs of deception or instability. What he saw instead was the same quiet intelligence he'd noticed in Thunder's eyes. "You've been living here?" "In the house. Not living, surviving. I come and go, but never regularly, never predictably. Thunder needs daily care, and I couldn't just abandon him." Harold's voice carried the weight of genuine affection as he stroked the horse's neck. "This boy's been my companion for 15 years. I raised him from a foal. Sarah said you owned thoroughbreds, showed them at fairs." Harold nodded, reaching into his pocket and pulling out a folded piece of paper. "This place used to be something special. Before everything went to hell." He handed Jake the paper. "Found this behind some loose wallpaper in the kitchen. Thought you might find it interesting." Jake unfolded what appeared to be a hand-drawn map of the property. It was detailed and precise, showing not just the buildings and pastures, but areas Jake hadn't even discovered yet. Symbols marked various locations. Some he could guess at, others were cryptic. "What are these marks?" Jake asked, pointing to a series of small X's near what looked like the creek. "That, my friend, is a very long story." Harold glanced toward the barn door, as if checking for unwelcome visitors. Harold Whitman might be officially missing, but unofficially. He's been doing some research into why certain people want this land so badly. Jake felt the familiar tingle of danger that had kept him alive through 2 tours in Afghanistan. "What kind of people?" "The kind that don't take no for an answer. About 6 months ago, I started getting visits from representatives of something called Meridian Development Corporation. Wanted to buy the ranch, offered good money. When I said no, they got persistent. When persistent didn't work, they got threatening. So you faked your disappearance to get them off your back." Harold's laugh was bitter. "I faked my disappearance to stay alive. These aren't people who accept defeat gracefully." He gestured toward the map in Jake's hands. "That property survey there shows things most folks don't know about this land. Things that make it worth a lot more than grazing rights and an old farmhouse." Jake studied the map more carefully. The symbols near the creek looked deliberate, purposeful. "What's special about the creek area?" This ranch sits on a section of what used to be called the Underground Railroad. During the Civil War, this was a safe house, a stopping point for people escaping slavery. The creek runs into a series of natural caves that provided shelter. Some of those caves were expanded, connected. There's a whole network underground that most people have forgotten about. And the development company knows about this? They know enough to want the land bad enough to threaten an old horse breeder. Harold moved to a wooden chest in the corner of the barn and pulled out a leather-bound book. This is what I've been working on since I went underground. Everything I could find about this property's history, about Meridian development, about why they want this specific piece of land so badly. Jake accepted the journal, feeling the weight of quality leather binding. The pages were filled with Harold's careful handwriting, newspaper clippings, photocopied documents, and sketches. You've been investigating them? Son, when you get to be my age and someone threatens to take away everything you've worked for your whole life, you learn to fight back with the tools you have. I might be old, but I'm not stupid, and I'm not helpless. Thunder had been listening to their conversation with the attention of a dog following a tennis match. Now he moved closer to Jake, sniffing at the journal in his hands. He knows that book, Harold said with a smile. Thunder's been my research partner. Horses have good instincts about people, better than humans do most of the time. He took to you right away, which tells me something about your character. Jake found himself oddly pleased by the horse's approval. So what happens now? I own the property legally, but you're telling me I'm walking into some kind of corporate warfare? I'm telling you that 50 cents might have been the most expensive purchase you ever made. Harold's expression grew serious. But I'm also telling you that sometimes the right thing to do isn't the easy thing to do. This land has history, meaning. It deserves better than being turned into a strip mall or a housing development. What exactly are you asking me to do? Harold was quiet for a long moment, stroking Thunder's nose thoughtfully. I'm asking you to read that journal, learn what I've learned, and then decide if a place like this is worth fighting for. Jake looked around the barn, at the careful craftsmanship in the stalls, the quality equipment, the obvious love that had gone into creating a home for horses. Thunder stood beside him like a gentle giant, radiating the kind of calm strength that seemed to anchor everything around him. Where have you been staying? There's an old hunting cabin about 2 miles into the woods. Been using that as my base. It's not much, but it's hidden and it's warm. Harold gathered up his equipment. I should go before full dark. Less chance of being spotted? Harold. Jake stopped the old man as he headed toward the door. Tomorrow, when you come to check on Thunder, come to the house. We need to talk more about this. If I'm going to fight for this place, I need to understand what I'm fighting against. Harold's weathered face broke into the first genuine smile Jake had seen from him. I was hoping you'd say that. Thunder picked well when he decided to trust you. As Harold disappeared into the darkness, Jake remained in the barn with Thunder, studying the map by flashlight. The property was larger than he'd realized, and the symbols suggested secrets that went back more than a century. He folded the map carefully and tucked it into his jacket pocket. Tomorrow, he would explore those marked areas, try to understand what made this land worth threatening an old man over. Thunder nudged his shoulder gently, and Jake reached up to stroke the horse's neck. Looks like we're in this together now, boy. Hope you're ready for whatever comes next. The horse whinnied softly, as if accepting the challenge, and Jake felt something he hadn't experienced in years. He felt like he belonged somewhere. Jake woke the next morning to the sound of a truck engine and voices outside. He'd spent the night in Harold's old bedroom, sleeping better than he had in months, on a mattress that actually supported his back. Through the window, he could see Sarah's veterinary truck parked near the barn, and she was talking with someone Jake didn't recognize. He pulled on his clothes and stepped outside, noting that Thunder was already turned out in the pasture, grazing contentedly. Sarah waved when she saw him approaching. Morning. Jake, I brought someone I thought you should meet. She gestured to the man beside her. A lanky fellow in his 60s, with the kind of deep tan that came from a lifetime of outdoor work. This is Pete Kowalski. He owns the feed store in town, but more importantly, he was Harold's neighbor for 20 years. Pete extended a weathered hand. Heard you bought the old place. 50 cents, huh? That's either the best deal or the worst mistake in real estate history. Still trying to figure out which, Jake replied, shaking the man's hand. Pete was just telling me some interesting things about Harold, Sarah said, her tone suggesting this wasn't casual conversation. Pete glanced around nervously, as if checking for eavesdroppers. Look, I don't know you from Adam, but Sarah says you're all right, and Thunder seems to like you. That's good enough for me. But there are things about Harold's disappearance that don't sit right. Such as? Such as the fact that Harold Whitman was the most routine man I ever knew. Fed his horses at 6 every morning, again at 6 every evening, rain or shine, sick or healthy. Then one day, nothing. No goodbye, no explanation, no forwarding address. That's not Harold. Jake thought about his encounter with the old man the night before. Harold was definitely alive, but Pete's loyalty suggested this was a man worth protecting. What do you think happened? I think Harold got scared. Pete's voice dropped lower. About 2 weeks before he disappeared, Harold came over to my place around midnight. Woke me up, which wasn't like him at all. Said he wanted to show me something, but not at his place. Too dangerous, he said. Sarah leaned forward. What did he show you? Pete reached into his back pocket and pulled out a faded photograph. This, said he found it in an old trunk in his attic. He handed the photo to Jake. The black and white image showed a much younger Thunder as a colt, standing beside a man in expensive riding gear. The man looked like Harold, but decades younger, and he was holding what appeared to be a ribbon or award. But it was the background that caught Jake's attention. The same barn, but in much better condition, with additional structures that were no longer there. Harold said this picture was taken when Thunder was just 2 years old. He'd won some kind of championship at a horse show in Denver. But look at the date stamp. Jake squinted at the small numbers in the corner of the photo. This says 1995, right, which would make Thunder about 30 years old now. Jake looked out at the pasture where Thunder was grazing, noting the horse's powerful build and energetic movement. That's impossible. Thunder looks like he's in his prime. That's what I said. Harold got this strange look in his eyes and said maybe Thunder was more special than anyone knew. Then he started talking crazy about bloodlines and genetics and things that didn't make much sense to a feed store owner. Sarah took the photograph and studied it carefully. Pete's right. If this date is accurate, Thunder should be ancient by horse standards. Most horses don't live much past 25 or 30, and they certainly don't maintain this kind of condition. Harold mentioned something else that night, Pete continued. Said there were people asking questions about Thunder specifically. Not just about the ranch, but about the horse. Wanted to know about his breeding records, his lineage, whether Harold had any documentation about Thunder's origins. Jake felt the pieces of yesterday's conversation with Harold clicking into place. The development company? Could be. Harold never said who, just that they were very interested in Thunder's background. Made him nervous enough to hide some things. What kind of things? Pete glanced around again, then gestured toward the barn. Maybe we should continue this conversation somewhere more private. They moved into the barn, where Thunder's empty stall still carried the scent of the magnificent horse. Pete walked directly to a specific loose board in the back wall and worked it free, with practiced ease. Harold showed me this hiding spot that night. Said if anything happened to him, I should make sure whoever ended up with Thunder knew about it. Pete reached into the space behind the board and pulled out a metal box about the size of a shoebox. Jake accepted the box, surprised by its weight. Inside, wrapped in oiled cloth, were documents that looked official and old. Horse registration papers, veterinary records, and something that made Jake's breath catch in his throat. These breeding papers show Thunder's lineage, going back 5 generations, Sarah said, reading over Jake's shoulder. Look at these names, Kentucky Derby winners, Preakness champions. If these are genuine, Thunder isn't just a valuable horse. He's priceless. But it was the veterinary record that truly shocked Jake. According to the documentation, Thunder had been tested for something called genetic longevity markers and had shown unprecedented cellular regeneration capabilities. What does that mean? Jake asked. Sarah's voice was barely a whisper. It means someone believed Thunder might live significantly longer than normal horses. Maybe decades longer, Pete nodded grimly. Harold said the last veterinary exam, Thunder, had showed the cellular structure of a horse half his age. Said it was like Thunder's body was resisting the normal aging process. Jake stared at the documents, then out at Thunder grazing peacefully in the pasture. So the development company isn't just after the land. They're after Thunder. That would be my guess, Pete said. And if Harold figured that out, it explains why he disappeared. He was protecting Thunder the only way he knew how. But why would a development company care about a horse's genetics? Sarah was still reading through the veterinary records. Genetic research is worth billions of dollars. If Thunder carries some kind of genetic anomaly that affects aging or cellular regeneration, the pharmaceutical applications could be enormous. The implications hit Jake like a physical blow. He'd thought he was dealing with a simple land grab by corporate developers. Instead, he'd stumbled into something involving genetic research and a horse that might hold the key to extending life itself. Thunder chose that moment to appear at the pasture fence, calling out to them with a soft whinny. The horse looked directly at Jake, and for a moment it felt like Thunder understood exactly what they were discussing. Harold was right to be scared, Jake said finally. This is bigger than real estate development. Question is, Pete said, gathering up the documents and returning them to their hiding place. What are you going to do about it? Jake looked at Thunder, then at Sarah and Pete. These people had entrusted him with information that could put them all in danger. But they'd also given him the tools to understand what he was really fighting for. I'm going to make sure Thunder stays safe, Jake said. And I'm going to find out exactly who these people are and what they really want. Sarah smiled for the first time since they'd entered the barn. Harold chose well when he decided to trust you with this place. 3 days later, Jake was learning that caring for a genetically unique horse wasn't much different from caring for a regular one. Thunder needed food, water, exercise, and companionship. What made him special wasn't visible in his daily routine, but in the quiet intelligence behind his eyes, and the way he seemed to understand conversations happening around him. Jake had spent the morning repairing fence posts and was just heading back to the house for lunch when he heard the sound of expensive engines coming up the gravel drive. 2 black SUVs with tinted windows pulled up in front of the farmhouse, and Jake felt his military instincts kick in immediately. The men who emerged from the vehicles wore suits that cost more than most people's monthly salary, but they moved with the controlled precision of people accustomed to getting their way through intimidation rather than negotiation. The leader was a thin man in his 50s, with silver hair and cold eyes. He approached Jake with a smile that never reached those eyes. Mr. Morrison, I'm David Kellerman, Senior Acquisition Specialist with Meridian Development Corporation. He extended a business card between 2 manicured fingers. I understand you recently purchased this property. Jake accepted the card without looking at it, keeping his attention on the other 3 men who had spread out in a loose semicircle around him. Professional security, he noted. The kind who knew how to handle themselves. That's right. Excellent. Then you're the man I need to speak with. Kellerman's smile widened, but his eyes remained calculating. I'm here to make you a very generous offer for this land. It's not for sale. Oh, I think you'll want to hear what we're prepared to offer before you make that decision. Kellerman gestured toward the property with dismissive casualness. This is 40 acres of marginal grazing land and some deteriorating structures. We're prepared to offer you $200,000. Cash. Today. Jake had been expecting this conversation since Harold's warnings, but the amount still surprised him. For property he'd bought for 50 cents, it was an enormous profit. It was also proof that Meridian Development wanted this land very badly. Like I said, it's not for sale. Kellerman's smile finally faltered. Mr. Morrison, I don't think you understand the situation here. This property has been targeted for development as part of a larger regional project. The previous owner's disappearance has delayed our timeline considerably. We're prepared to be very generous to expedite the transfer, and I'm prepared to be very clear. The property isn't for sale at any price. From the pasture, Thunder had noticed the visitors and was moving toward the fence, his ears back and his posture alert. The horse's instincts about these men seemed to match Jake's own growing unease. One of Kellerman's associates, a large man with the build of an ex-football player, stepped closer. "Mr. Morrison, perhaps you don't understand how these situations typically resolve themselves. Property acquisitions can be complicated, especially when the current owner isn't cooperative." Jake's hand moved casually to his belt, where his knife rested in its worn leather sheath. "And perhaps you don't understand that I'm not the kind of person who responds well to threats." Kellerman held up a hand to his associate, but his tone had lost all pretense of friendliness. "No one's threatening anyone, Mr. Morrison. We're simply explaining that this acquisition will happen, one way or another. The question is whether you participate willingly and profit from the transaction, or whether you make things difficult for everyone involved." Thunder had reached the fence and was pacing along the rail line, clearly agitated by the presence of the strangers. His powerful muscles were tense, and he kept his attention focused on the group of men near the house. "I notice you have livestock," Kellerman observed, following Jake's glance toward the horse. "Beautiful animal. It would be unfortunate if something happened to him due to your stubbornness." That was the line Jake had been waiting for them to cross. His voice dropped to the low, dangerous tone that had once made enemy combatants reconsider their life choices. "If anything happens to that horse, I will hold you personally responsible." Kellerman's mask of civility finally slipped completely. "Mr. Morrison, I think you're failing to grasp the reality of your situation. Meridian Development Corporation has extensive resources and a long reach. We've been very patient with the delays caused by Harold Whitman's disappearance, but our patience isn't unlimited." Harold Whitman disappeared. Jake asked innocently, "Come now, we both know you've been asking questions around town. Small communities love to gossip." Kellerman straightened his tie with deliberate precision. "The point is, Harold Whitman is no longer a factor in this equation. You are, and you can either be a reasonable factor or a problematic one." Jake looked at the business card in his hand for the first time. Expensive paper, embossed lettering, and a phone number with a Washington, D.C. area code. "These weren't local developers." "I'll give you the same answer Harold would have given you. This property isn't for sale. We'll see about that." Kellerman nodded to his associates, and they began moving toward their vehicles. "Mr. Morrison, you have 48 hours to reconsider our offer. After that, the terms become significantly less generous, and if I still say no..." Kellerman paused at his car door. "Then you'll discover why Harold Whitman found it necessary to disappear." The SUVs pulled away in a cloud of dust, leaving Jake standing alone in his yard with Thunder watching from the pasture. The horse was still agitated, pacing and snorting, clearly sensing the threat that had just departed. Jake walked over to the fence and reached out to stroke Thunder's neck. The horse calmed immediately at his touch, but remained alert, scanning the horizon as if expecting the men to return. "Easy, boy. They're gone for now." Jake studied the business card again, memorizing the details. "But I have a feeling they'll be back." Thunder nudged Jake's shoulder with his massive head, and Jake had the distinct impression the horse was trying to tell him something. Something about danger, about the need to be careful, about the fact that the peaceful days of learning to care for a horse were about to end. That evening, Jake called the number Pete had given him and asked the feed store owner to spread the word quietly. Anyone who cared about Harold Whitman and Thunder should know that Meridian Development Corporation was escalating their efforts to acquire the ranch. The war for Thunder and the secrets he carried was about to begin. That night, Jake couldn't sleep. Kellerman's threats echoed in his mind, and every sound from outside made him reach for the pistol he'd placed on the nightstand. At 3 a.m, he gave up on rest and made his way to the kitchen to make coffee. Harold was sitting at the kitchen table, reading by lamplight, Figured you might be having trouble sleeping, the old man said, without looking up from his book. Heard you had visitors today. Jake poured 2 cups of coffee and sat across from Harold. Word travels fast in a small town, Pete called. Said Kellerman finally showed his face. Harold's weathered hands wrapped around the coffee mug. That man's been a thorn in my side for months. What did he offer you? 200,000 cash, Harold whistled low. That's more than he offered me. You must have them worried. He also threatened Thunder. Harold's eyes hardened. That was his mistake. Threatening Thunder means they've stopped pretending this is about real estate development. Jake studied the old man's face. Harold looked tired, older than he had just a few days ago. Living in hiding was taking its toll. Harold, what exactly did you discover that made you disappear? It's time you told me everything. Harold was quiet for a long moment, then stood and walked to the living room. He returned with a leather-bound journal, the same one he'd shown Jake briefly in the barn. This is 3 months of research into Meridian Development Corporation and why they want Thunder. Jake opened the journal and began reading Harold's careful handwriting. The first entries were straightforward research. Corporate filings, business registrations, lists of board members and financial backers. But as the entries progressed, the picture that emerged was disturbing. Meridian Development isn't really a development company, Harold explained. It's a front organization for something called Prometheus Biotech. They specialize in genetic research, specifically research into cellular regeneration and life extension. Jake looked up from the journal. They know about Thunder's longevity markers. They know more than that. Look at the entry from 2 months ago. Jake flipped to the indicated page and found photocopies of what appeared to be internal corporate memos. The language was technical, but the implications were clear. Prometheus Biotech had been tracking horses with unusual genetic markers for years, and Thunder was at the top of their list. According to this, they've been monitoring Thunder since he was 5 years old, Jake said, reading the documents. How is that possible? Harold Whitman wasn't Thunder's first owner, Harold said quietly. I bought him from a research facility that was shutting down. They told me he was a failed experiment, that he'd never amount to anything special. I thought I was rescuing him. Jake continued reading, finding entries that detailed Harold's growing realization of what he'd stumbled into. They've been waiting for you to die so they could claim Thunder legally. Except I'm a stubborn old man who refused to cooperate with their timeline. Harold's smile was grim. So they decided to accelerate the process. The journal contained photographs Harold had taken with a telephoto lens. Images of men watching the ranch from a distance. License plates of vehicles that had driven by repeatedly. Documentation of phone calls, where the caller hung up when Harold answered. They've been stalking you for months. They want Thunder alive and cooperative. Killing me outright would have created complications, questions from law enforcement. But an old man disappearing, leaving behind unpaid taxes and an abandoned property. That's much cleaner. Jake found the entry that made his blood run cold. Harold had discovered that Meridian Development had acquired 3 other properties in different states. All of them previously owned by people who had died under suspicious circumstances shortly after refusing to sell. Harold, these people are killers. I know. That's why I disappeared. And that's why I was hoping someone like you would buy the property. Someone like me. Harold smiled for the first time since Jake had opened the journal. Someone with the skills to fight back. Pete did some asking around about you after you arrived. 2 tours in Afghanistan, decorated combat veteran, grew up around horses. Either you're exactly what Thunder and I needed, or it's the most convenient coincidence in history. Jake closed the journal, his mind processing the implications. You planned this. You wanted the property to go to tax auction. I hoped it would go to someone who would care about Thunder and be willing to stand up to corporate bullies. I just got luckier than I expected. A sound from outside made both men freeze. Car engines moving slowly without headlights. Jake moved to the window and peered through the curtains. 2 vehicles were approaching the house, their occupants clearly trying to remain undetected. Harold, is there another way out of here? The old man was already moving toward the back of the house. Through the kitchen. There's a path through the woods that leads to my cabin. Jake grabbed the journal and followed Harold toward the rear of the house. As they reached the kitchen, the sound of car doors closing quietly came from the front yard. "They're not waiting for their 48-hour deadline," Jake whispered. Harold handed him a flashlight. "The path starts behind the woodshed. Follow it for half a mile, then turn left at the old oak tree. My cabin's another quarter-mile from there. What about Thunder?" "Thunder can take care of himself for one night. Right now, we need to make sure we survive to protect him tomorrow." Jake heard the soft sound of someone testing the front door handle. These weren't the same men who had visited during the day. These were professionals, moving with the silence of people who specialized in making problems disappear. Harold was already heading for the back door. Jake took one last look at the kitchen, where he'd been planning to make this house a home, then followed the old man into the darkness. Behind them, the front door opened with the soft click of professional lockpicks, and voices whispered instructions in the language of people who were very good at making other people vanish. Harold's cabin was exactly what Jake had expected from a man living in hiding. Small, functional, and positioned with clear sight lines in all directions. They'd made the journey through the woods in tense silence, pausing frequently to listen for sounds of pursuit. "They'll search the house and barn, then probably set up surveillance," Harold said, lighting a small kerosene lamp. "We should be safe here until morning." Jake settled into a wooden chair that had seen better days. "This can't continue indefinitely. Eventually they'll find this place, or they'll do something to Thunder. I know. That's why I need to ask you something, and I need you to think carefully before you answer." Harold poured whiskey into two mismatched glasses. "Are you willing to take legal ownership of Thunder? Officially, permanently?" "What do you mean?" Harold pulled a manila envelope from beneath his mattress. "I've had my lawyer draw up transfer papers. Everything legal and binding. If something happens to me, Thunder becomes yours completely. No questions, no complications." Jake accepted the whiskey but didn't drink it. "Harold, I can't take your horse. You're not taking him. I'm giving him to you. There's a difference." Harold's voice carried the weight of a man who'd made a difficult decision. "I'm 73 years old, Jake. I've had 15 good years with Thunder, but I can't protect him anymore." "You can. I don't know anything about horses with genetic anomalies or corporate conspiracies. You know how to fight. You know how to survive. And Thunder trusts you," Harold smiled. "That's more than most people can offer." They spent the rest of the night planning. Harold knew the property better than anyone, understood Thunder's routines and needs, and had months of research into Meridian Development's methods. Jake brought tactical thinking and the kind of situational awareness that had kept him alive in hostile territory. At dawn, they made their way carefully back toward the ranch. The intruders' vehicles were gone, but Jake approached the barn with military caution. Thunder was pacing in his stall, clearly agitated but unharmed. "Easy, boy," Jake murmured, approaching slowly. Thunder calmed immediately at the sound of his voice, but remained alert and nervous. Harold checked the barn thoroughly, while Jake examined Thunder for any signs of interference. "They didn't touch him," Harold concluded. "But they were definitely here. Look. Feed buckets had been moved, stall doors opened and closed, equipment shifted. Someone had conducted a thorough search of the barn, looking for something specific. What were they after?" Jake asked. "Probably the same thing I've been hiding for months." Harold moved to Thunder's stall and began examining the horse's tack. "They know Thunder's valuable, but they need documentation to prove ownership if they steal him." Harold's hands moved along Thunder's bridle with practiced familiarity, then stopped. "That's strange." "What?" Harold was examining a small medallion attached to the bridle, partially hidden beneath Thunder's mane. "This wasn't here yesterday." He worked the medallion free and held it up to the morning light. It was silver, tarnished with age, and engraved with words Jake could barely make out. "Forever faithful," he read aloud. "This is Thunder's original medallion," Harold said, his voice filled with wonder. "I thought it was lost years ago, when I bought him from the research facility." Jake studied the medallion more closely. "Someone returned it to him? Or Thunder led them to where it was hidden?" Harold's expression was thoughtful. This horse is more intelligent than people give him credit for. I think he's been trying to tell us something. Thunder nudged Harold's shoulder gently, then looked directly at Jake. The horse's eyes held that same deep intelligence Jake had noticed from the first day. But now there seemed to be urgency in his gaze. "What is it, boy?" Jake asked, reaching out to stroke Thunder's neck. Thunder moved to the back corner of his stall and began pawing at the ground with his front hoof. The behavior was deliberate, focused, not the random movement of a restless animal. Harold frowned. "He's never done that before." Jake knelt down and examined the area Thunder was indicating. The ground was packed earth, but there were subtle differences in color and texture. "Harold, I think there's something buried here." They found shovels and began digging carefully. About 2 feet down, Jake's shovel struck something solid, metal. Working together, they uncovered a waterproof case about the size of a briefcase. Inside the case, wrapped in plastic, were documents that made Harold's breath catch. "These are Thunder's original research files. From the laboratory where I bought him," Jake read over Harold's shoulder. The documents detailed experiments in genetic manipulation, cellular regeneration research, and something called Project Methuselah. Thunder hadn't been a failed experiment. He'd been the successful one. They didn't just monitor Thunder's genetics, Jake said. They created them, and according to this, he's not the only one. There were 12 horses in the original experiment. Thunder is the only survivor. The implications were staggering. Thunder wasn't just genetically unique. He was the product of deliberate scientific manipulation, possibly the only living proof that genetic life extension was possible. Thunder had led them to evidence that proved his own value and explained why meridian development would kill to possess him. The horse had been trying to help them understand what they were fighting for. Jake looked at Thunder with new respect. "You've been protecting these documents all along, haven't you, boy?" Thunder nickered softly and pressed his head against Jake's chest. In that moment, Jake felt the full weight of responsibility settle on his shoulders. This wasn't just about a horse anymore. It was about protecting the future of genetic research from people who would use it for profit rather than healing. "Harold, we need to get these documents to someone who can help us." "Sarah," Harold said immediately. "She's a veterinarian, but she also has contacts at the state university. People who would understand what these files mean." Jake carefully repacked the documents, while Harold prepared Thunder for what might be a long day. They were no longer just hiding from corporate bullies. They were protecting scientific breakthrough that could change the world. And Thunder, the magnificent horse who had started this entire journey, had just shown them that he was more than a passive victim. He was an active participant in his own protection. Sarah arrived at the ranch within an hour of Harold's phone call, but she wasn't alone. She'd brought Dr. Marcus Webb from the State University's Veterinary Genetics Program, a man whose reputation in equine research was known throughout the region. "These documents are extraordinary," Dr. Webb said after spending 20 minutes reviewing Thunder's research files. "If they're authentic, this represents a breakthrough in genetic longevity research that's decades ahead of current science." "They're authentic," Harold confirmed. "I've been caring for Thunder for 15 years. I've seen firsthand what makes him different." Dr. Webb looked at Thunder with the fascination of a scientist encountering something that shouldn't exist. "May I examine him?" For the next hour, Dr. Webb conducted the most thorough veterinary examination Thunder had ever received. Blood samples, tissue samples, detailed measurements and observations. Thunder tolerated the process with remarkable patience, as if he understood the importance of what was happening. "Incredible," Dr. Webb murmured, reviewing his preliminary findings. "His cellular structure shows virtually no signs of aging. If I didn't know better, I'd say this horse was maybe 8 or 10 years old, not 30. What does that mean for Thunder?" Jake asked. "It means he could potentially live for decades longer than normal horses, maybe a century or more. And it means these research files represent knowledge that certain people would kill for." The sound of vehicles approaching made everyone freeze. Jake moved to the window and cursed under his breath. 3 trucks this time. And they're not trying to hide their approach. But as the vehicles came into view, Jake realized these weren't Meridian Development's people. The trucks were county vehicles, and the man getting out of the lead truck wore a sheriff's uniform. "Dr. Webb, you need to take those research files and get Thunder out of here," Jake said urgently. "Where?" Harold was already moving toward Thunder's stall. "There's an old trail that leads to the back pasture. Sarah knows it. Take Thunder there and keep him hidden until we know what's happening." Jake watched through the window as Sheriff Tom Brennan approached the house. He'd met Brennan briefly in town, and the man had seemed honest and straightforward. But Jake had learned that appearances could be deceiving. "Mr. Morrison," Sheriff Brennan called out, "I need to speak with you." Jake stepped outside, keeping his hands visible and his posture non-threatening. "Sheriff, what can I do for you?" "I've received reports of suspicious activity on this property. Break-ins, trespassing, people living here without proper documentation." Brennan's expression was serious but not hostile. "I need to ask you some questions." "Such as?" "Such as whether you've seen Harold Whitman recently. He's been reported missing, but there are indications he might still be in the area." Jake studied the sheriff's face, looking for signs of deception or hidden agendas. What he saw was a man who genuinely seemed concerned about Harold's welfare. "Sheriff, can I ask who made these reports?" "Anonymous tip. Came in this morning." Brennan pulled out a small notebook. "Caller said there were people living illegally on the Whitman property, possibly the missing owner himself." Jake realized this was Meridian Development's next move. If they couldn't intimidate him into selling and couldn't steal Thunder outright, they'd use law enforcement to complicate the situation. "Sheriff, I legally own this property. I have the deed and the tax auction documentation. I'm not questioning your ownership, Mr. Morrison, but I am concerned about reports of Harold Whitman being held here against his will." Before Jake could respond, Harold himself appeared around the corner of the barn. "Hello, Tom. Heard you were looking for me." Sheriff Brennan's expression shifted from official concern to personal relief. "Harold, thank God. Do you have any idea how worried people have been? There's been a missing person report filed on you." "By who?" "Anonymous report to the state police 3 months ago. Said you disappeared under suspicious circumstances." Brennan studied Harold's appearance. "You look good for a missing person." Harold smiled. "Tom, I need to show you something. But first, I need to know if you filed those reports or if someone else is using your department to harass Mr. Morrison here." "I didn't file anything. This is the first I've heard about any of this." Brennan's tone suggested he was beginning to understand that something more complicated was happening. Harold gestured toward the barn. "Then you need to see what we found this morning." They were halfway to the barn when Jake noticed movement near the tree line. Men with cameras, taking photographs from a distance. Professional surveillance, but sloppy enough to be spotted. "Sheriff, we're being watched," Jake said quietly. Brennan followed Jake's gaze, and his hand moved instinctively toward his service weapon. "Harold, what kind of trouble are you in?" "The kind that involves corporate espionage and genetic research worth millions of dollars." Harold's voice was grim. "Tom, I need you to understand that Jake and I are the good guys here." As they entered the barn, Jake noticed something that made his blood run cold. The area where they'd found Thunder's research files had been disturbed again. Fresh digging, careful but obvious to someone who knew what to look for. "They were back," Jake said, "while we were dealing with Dr. Webb's examination." Harold knelt down and examined the disturbed earth. "They found something. Look." He pointed to a small piece of paper partially buried in the loose soil. Jake carefully extracted what appeared to be a fragment of an old map. The paper was yellowed with age, and the markings looked hand-drawn. "This wasn't part of Thunder's research files. This looks like the original property survey map," Harold said, studying the fragment. "But it shows things that aren't on any modern maps." The fragment depicted what appeared to be a tunnel system beneath the ranch, with markings that suggested multiple entry points and a complex underground network. Sheriff Brennan examined the map fragment with growing concern. "Harold, are you telling me there are tunnels under this property?" I'm telling you that this ranch has a history that goes back a lot further than horse breeding." Harold's expression was thoughtful. "Tom, this land was a stop on the Underground Railroad during the Civil War. There are caves and tunnels that were used to hide people escaping slavery." Jake felt the pieces clicking together. "And Meridian Development knows about the tunnels, which explains why they want the land so badly," Harold added. "It's not just about thunder. There's something else down there." The sound of more vehicles approaching cut their conversation short. This time, Jake recognized the black SUVs of Meridian Development. But now they were accompanied by official-looking vehicles with government plates. "Sheriff," Jake said urgently, "I think we're about to find out just how far Meridian Development's influence reaches." Brennan's hand was now resting on his weapon. "Harold, Jake, I need you both to stay close to me. Whatever's happening here, it's bigger than a simple missing person case." As the vehicle stopped in front of the ranch house, Jake counted at least 8 men emerging from the cars. Some wore suits, others wore the tactical gear of federal agents. At the center of the group was David Kellerman, wearing the satisfied smile of a man who believed he held all the cards. "Sheriff Brennan," Kellerman called out, approaching with official-looking documents in his hand. "I have federal warrants for the search and seizure of this property and all livestock contained therein." Jake looked at the map fragment in his hand, then at Harold and Sheriff Brennan. Thunder was hidden in the back pasture with Sarah and Dr. Webb, but for how long? And what exactly was Meridian Development looking for in those underground tunnels? The answers were about to become very dangerous for everyone involved. Sheriff Brennan examined Kellerman's documents with the careful attention of a man who'd learned not to trust paperwork that arrived with armed escorts. "These warrants are federal, but they're not specific about what you're looking for." "That's classified information, Sheriff," Kellerman replied smoothly. "But I can assure you everything is legal and properly authorized." Jake watched the exchange while his mind raced through options. The federal warrants would give Kellerman's people legal authority to search the property and seize Thunder, but there was something about the timing that felt wrong. "Mr. Kellerman," Jake interrupted, "these warrants are dated yesterday. How did you know to obtain federal search warrants before you even knew what we'd found?" Kellerman's confident expression flickered for just a moment. "Routine investigative procedure, Mr. Morrison, for a missing person case." Sheriff Brennan's tone suggested he was asking the same questions Jake was thinking. Harold stepped forward, and Jake noticed the old man was carrying something wrapped in a cloth. "Tom, before these gentlemen begin their search, there's something you need to see. Something that might explain why they're so interested in this particular piece of land." Harold unwrapped what appeared to be an old coin, tarnished but clearly valuable. "Found this in the tunnel entrance about an hour ago." Sheriff Brennan accepted the coin and examined it carefully. "This looks like a gold piece. 1800s, maybe?" 1847 to be exact, Harold confirmed. "And it's not the only one down there." Kellerman's professional calm finally cracked. "Mr. Whitman, I must advise you that removing artifacts from a federal investigation site is a serious crime." "Federal investigation site?" Harold's eyebrows rose. "Tom, when did my ranch become a federal investigation site?" Sheriff Brennan was studying the warrants more carefully now. "Mr. Kellerman, these warrants mention suspected terrorist activity and national security concerns." "Are you telling me Harold Whitman is a terrorist?" "I'm telling you that this property contains materials and information that are matters of national security." Kellerman gestured to his associates, who began moving toward the barn. "We need to secure the area immediately." Jake realized they were out of time for legal maneuvering. "Harold, show the sheriff the tunnel entrance, now." Harold led them around the barn to an area where Jake hadn't noticed anything unusual during his previous explorations. Harold knelt down and brushed away leaves and debris, revealing what looked like a natural depression in the ground. "The entrance is hidden, but it's been here for over a century and a half." Harold worked at something Jake couldn't see, then lifted what appeared to be a wooden cover, disguised to look like natural ground cover. Beneath the cover was a hole large enough for a person to squeeze through. with rough stone steps leading down into darkness. These tunnels were carved out during the Civil War, Harold explained. Escaped slaves used them as hiding places on their way north. But according to the research I've been doing, they were also used to hide other things. Sheriff Brennan shone his flashlight down into the tunnel. What kind of other things? Gold, weapons, documents, anything that needed to be kept safe during the war. Harold held up the gold coin again. This is just the beginning. Jake understood now why Meridian Development wanted the property so badly. Thunder's genetic value was enormous, but a cache of Civil War-era gold would be worth millions in today's market. "Sheriff," Kellerman said urgently, "I need you to secure this area immediately. This is exactly the kind of discovery that falls under federal jurisdiction." "Funny thing about that," Sheriff Brennan replied, his tone suggesting he'd made a decision about who he trusted. "These tunnels have been here for over a century. If they contain historical artifacts, they'd fall under the jurisdiction of the State Historical Commission, not federal terrorism investigators." Kellerman's hand moved toward his jacket, and Jake's military instincts kicked in immediately. But before anyone could react, the sound of horses approaching at a gallop made everyone turn toward the pasture. Thunder was running toward them at full speed, with Sarah clinging to his back and Dr. Webb running behind them. The horse's eyes were wide with fear, and he was calling out with the kind of distressed whinnying that indicated real danger. "Something's wrong," Sarah called out as Thunder slowed near the group. "There are men in the back pasture." Armed men, and they were asking about underground entrances. Jake felt the situation shifting from complicated to dangerous. "How many men?" "At least 6. They had metal detectors and digging equipment." Dr. Webb was breathing hard from his run. "They weren't interested in Thunder. They were looking for something else." Harold's expression grew grim. "They're not just after Thunder. They're after whatever's hidden in those tunnels." Thunder had calmed down now that he was near Jake, but the horse remained alert and nervous. He kept looking toward the tunnel entrance, then back at Jake, as if trying to communicate something important. "What is it, boy?" Jake asked, reaching out to stroke Thunder's neck. Thunder moved toward the tunnel entrance and began pawing at the ground near the opening. But instead of the random movement Jake had seen before, this was deliberate, focused. Thunder was indicating a specific spot. Jake knelt down and examined the area Thunder was pointing to. Hidden beneath a thin layer of soil was another wooden cover, smaller than the main entrance but clearly leading to the same tunnel system. "There's more than one way in," Jake realized. Harold nodded grimly. "The tunnels connect to at least 3 different entrance points on the property. If Meridian Development's people are searching with metal detectors, they'll find them all eventually." Sheriff Brennan was speaking quietly into his radio, calling for backup. But Jake could see Kellerman talking to his own people, and their body language suggested they were preparing for action rather than waiting for legal authorization. "Harold," Jake said urgently, "is there anything else down in those tunnels that we need to know about?" Harold looked at Thunder, then at the hidden entrance, then back at Jake. "There's something I never told you about why I really bought Thunder from that research facility." "What?" "They didn't just experiment on horses. They experimented on the genetic material they found in those tunnels. Civil War-era organic samples that had been preserved in the underground environment for over a century." Harold's voice dropped to a whisper. Thunder's longevity genes didn't come from random genetic manipulation. They came from people who lived during the 1800s, people whose genetic material was found right here, in these tunnels. The implications hit Jake like a physical blow. Thunder wasn't just genetically unique. He carried the genetic legacy of people who had died defending freedom over a century ago, and Meridian Development would do anything to possess that legacy for themselves. "Thunder," whinnied softly and pressed against Jake's shoulder, as if sensing the weight of responsibility that had just settled on them all. The standoff lasted exactly 47 minutes. Jake knew because he'd been counting, using the time to study Kellerman's people and plan escape routes. Sheriff Brennan had called for state backup, but the nearest units were over an hour away. Kellerman's team had the advantage of numbers and federal authority, but they were also operating on questionable legal ground. The stalemate broke when a state police vehicle arrived, followed immediately by a van from the State Historical Commission. Dr. Webb had been making phone calls of his own. Dr. Elizabeth Santos, State Historical Commission, announced the woman emerging from the van. She was in her 50s, with the no-nonsense demeanor of someone accustomed to protecting historical sites from people who wanted to exploit them. "I understand there's been a discovery of potential Civil War-era artifacts on this property." Kellerman's confidence wavered for the first time. "Dr. Santos, this is a federal investigation. I have warrants, and I have state authority over historical preservation sites." Dr. Santos examined Kellerman's paperwork with the practiced eye of someone who dealt with overreaching federal agencies before. "These warrants are for suspected terrorist activity." "Are you telling me the Underground Railroad was a terrorist organization, Mr. Kellerman?" While the officials argued jurisdiction, Jake noticed that Kellerman's associates were quietly positioning themselves around the property. They weren't planning to wait for legal resolution. "Harold," Jake murmured, "we need to get Thunder and those research files away from here. Now." Harold nodded towards Sarah, who was still staying close to Thunder. "Sarah knows a back trail that leads to the state forest. If we can get Thunder there, it'll be harder for them to follow." But as they prepared to move, a process server emerged from one of the state vehicles and approached Jake with official-looking documents. "Jake Morrison? You're being served with a court summons." The man handed Jake a thick envelope. "You're required to appear in federal court tomorrow morning regarding ownership disputes and suspected violations of federal research regulations." Jake opened the envelope and found himself looking at legal language that essentially accused him of illegally possessing federal research assets and interfering with national security investigations. The summons demanded that he surrender all livestock and research materials to federal custody pending a formal hearing. "This is a setup," Jake said, showing the papers to Sheriff Brennan. "They're using the legal system to steal Thunder while making it look legitimate." Dr. Santos read the summons over Jake's shoulder. "This is highly irregular. Federal research regulations don't typically apply to privately owned livestock, especially animals with clear ownership documentation, unless those animals are the products of federally funded genetic research," Kellerman interjected smoothly. "Which, according to our records, this particular horse is." Harold stepped forward with Thunder's original research files. "Then you'll be interested in these documents, which show that Thunder was declared a failed experiment and sold legally to a private owner 15 years ago." Kellerman's eyes locked onto the research files with unmistakable hunger. "Those documents are classified federal property, Mr. Whitman. Possessing them is a federal crime." "Funny," Harold replied. "The research facility that sold me Thunder included these files as part of the sale. If they're classified, why were they given to a private citizen?" Jake watched the legal maneuvering while keeping one eye on Kellerman's associates. They were getting restless, and he had the distinct feeling that legal niceties were about to become irrelevant. Thunder seemed to sense the tension as well. The horse moved closer to Jake, positioning himself between Jake and Kellerman's people. For an animal that was supposedly the product of genetic experimentation, Thunder showed remarkable understanding of human conflict dynamics. "Dr. Santos," Jake said, "what would it take to get this property designated as a protected historical site? Evidence of significant historical artifacts and documentation of the site's role in the Underground Railroad." Dr. Santos gestured toward the tunnel entrance. "If these tunnels can be authenticated, and if they contain period artifacts, I could have this property under state protection within hours." Kellerman obviously understood the implications. "Dr. Santos, I strongly advise against interfering with a federal investigation, and I strongly advise against using federal authority to circumvent state historical preservation laws." Dr. Santos turned to Harold. "Mr. Whitman, I'd like permission to conduct a preliminary archaeological survey of these tunnels." "Granted," Harold said immediately. Jake realized this was their chance. While the officials focused on the tunnels, he could get Thunder to safety. But as he moved toward the horse, one of Kellerman's associates stepped into his path. "I'm sorry, Mr. Morrison, but that animal needs to remain here pending resolution of the federal summons." Jake's military training kicked in as he assessed the man blocking his way. Professional security, probably former military himself, definitely armed. But there was something in the man's eyes that suggested he wasn't entirely comfortable with his orders. "What's your name?" Jake asked quietly. "Rodriguez." "Former Marine, Afghanistan or Iraq?" "Both." Rodriguez's expression shifted slightly. "You?" "Afghanistan. 2 tours." Jake met the man's eyes directly. "Marine, I need you to look at that horse and tell me if this feels right to you." Rodriguez glanced at Thunder, who was watching their conversation with intelligent eyes. "Orders are orders. Orders to steal a horse from a combat veteran who bought property legally." Jake's voice carried the quiet authority of someone who'd led men in combat. "Rodriguez, you know what's right here." For a moment, Jake thought he'd gotten through to the man, but Kellerman's voice cut through the tension. "Rodriguez, secure that animal immediately. We're done waiting for legal authorization." The moment of decision had arrived. Jake could see Dr. Santos and her team preparing to enter the tunnels, Sheriff Brennan trying to sort out jurisdiction with the state police, and Harold protecting Thunder's research files. Everyone was focused on their immediate concerns, except Thunder himself, who was looking directly at Jake with an expression that seemed to say, "It's time to run." Jake made his choice. "Harold, Sarah, we're leaving, now." "You can't," Kellerman shouted. "That horse is under federal protection order." "That horse," Jake replied, swinging himself onto Thunder's back with the ease of someone who'd grown up around horses, "belongs to me." "And I'm taking him somewhere safe," Thunder responded immediately, as if he'd been waiting for exactly this moment. Without any apparent signal from Jake, the horse wheeled around and began moving toward the tree line at a pace that was fast enough to outdistance pursuit, but controlled enough to keep Jake safely mounted. Behind them, Jake could hear Kellerman shouting orders and vehicles starting engines. But Thunder knew this land better than any of Kellerman's people, and Jake was beginning to understand that this horse was far more than a genetic experiment. Thunder was a partner, and partners protected each other. As they reached the safety of the forest, Jake looked back to see Harold giving him a thumbs up, while Dr. Santos disappeared into the tunnel entrance. The battle for Thunder and the secrets he carried was far from over, but at least they'd won this round. The question was, how many more rounds could they survive? 3 hours later, Jake and Thunder were hidden in a grove of ancient oaks about 5 miles from the ranch. Thunder had led them through trails that didn't appear on any map, moving with the confidence of an animal that knew every inch of the surrounding forest. They'd stopped twice to listen for pursuit, but the woods remained silent, except for natural sounds. Jake's phone buzzed with a text from Sarah. "Dr. Santos found something incredible. Meet at the old Miller place at sunset." The Miller place was an abandoned farmhouse about 2 miles north of Harold's ranch, a structure that had been empty for decades but was still sound enough to provide shelter. Jake had noticed it during his initial exploration of the area. As the sun began to set, Jake carefully made his way to the rendezvous point, leading Thunder through dense woodland that provided cover from any surveillance. The old farmhouse sat in a clearing that offered good visibility in all directions, and Jake could see Sarah's truck parked behind the structure. Inside, he found not just Sarah, but Harold, Dr. Santos, and Pete Kowalski. They'd transformed the dusty interior into an impromptu command center, with documents spread across a table made from old wooden crates. "Jake," Dr. Santos called out as he entered, "you need to see what we found in those tunnels." The documents on the table were unlike anything Jake had expected. Handwritten letters, official-looking certificates, and what appeared to be a formal government document bearing the seal of the United States Department of the Interior. This, Dr. Santos said, holding up an ornate certificate, is a historical preservation designation from 1987. The Harold Whitman Ranch was officially recognized as a protected historical site due to its significance in the Underground Railroad network. Jake studied the document carefully. If the property is already protected, how can Kellerman get federal warrants to search it? Because someone buried this designation so thoroughly that even the current county records don't show it, Harold explained. I never knew it existed until Dr. Santos found it sealed in a waterproof container in the main tunnel chamber. Pete leaned forward from where he'd been examining other documents. There's more. Look at this. He handed Jake what appeared to be a letter written on official government stationery, dated just 3 months ago. The letterhead read, Department of Genetic Research Oversight. This is a federal order suspending all research activities related to Project Methuselah, Jake read aloud. Due to ethical violations and unauthorized human genetic material acquisition, all assets related to this project are to be secured pending investigation. Sarah's expression was grim. Prometheus Biotech was shut down by the federal government 3 months ago. The same time, Harold disappeared, which means Kellerman and his people aren't legitimate federal agents, Dr. Santos concluded. They're operating outside legal authority to recover assets from a terminated research program. Jake felt the pieces clicking into place. They're stealing thunder to cover up their own crimes, Harold nodded. And they're using fake federal authority to do it. The real government shut down their research. Now they're trying to steal thunder to continue their work privately. But why the elaborate charade with federal warrants and terrorism investigations? Jake asked. Because thunder represents millions of dollars in research investment, Dr. Santos explained. If they can claim he's a security asset or a terrorist threat, they can bypass normal legal processes and take him before anyone realizes what's happening. Pete pulled out another document from the collection. This explains the local angle. Kellerman's been paying county officials to suppress the historical designation and facilitate the tax auction. They wanted the property to change hands so they could claim salvage rights to any research assets found on it. Jake stared at the evidence spread across the table. Harold's ranch wasn't just protected by historical designation. It was the center of a conspiracy involving corrupted research, federal cover-ups, and local government corruption. So what do we do with this information? Jake asked. Dr. Santos smiled for the first time since he'd met her. We use it. I've already contacted the real federal authorities, the ones who shut down Project Methuselah. They're very interested in locating missing research assets and the people who've been trying to steal them. How long before they get here? Tomorrow morning. Which means we need to keep Thunder safe for one more night. Jake looked out the window toward where Thunder was grazing peacefully in the moonlight. The horse had found good grass and seemed content, but Jake could see the alert way Thunder kept his head up, constantly scanning for threats. There's something else, Harold said quietly. Dr. Santos found records in the tunnels that show Thunder isn't the only survivor of the genetic experiments. What do you mean? Sarah opened a folder Jake hadn't noticed before. According to these files, there were 3 horses that survived the initial genetic modifications. Thunder was the most successful, but the other 2 were relocated to facilities in different states. Relocated when? 3 months ago. The same time Prometheus Biotech was shut down. Dr. Santos spread out what appeared to be transportation records. The other horses were moved to private facilities controlled by Meridian Development Corporation. Jake understood the implications immediately. Thunder isn't just valuable for his genetics. He's the only one of the 3 horses that they don't control. Exactly. And according to the research notes, the genetic modifications were designed to work best when all 3 horses' genetic material was combined. Harold's voice was heavy with concern. They need Thunder to complete whatever they're really trying to accomplish, which is... Dr. Santos handed Jake a research summary that made his blood run cold. According to these documents, the goal of Project Methuselah wasn't just to extend horse lifespans. It was to use the horses as a testing ground for human genetic life extension. Thunder and the other horses were never the end goal. They were the stepping stones to creating humans who could live for centuries. Jake looked out at Thunder again, seeing the magnificent animal in an entirely new light. Thunder wasn't just carrying the genetic legacy of Civil War-era heroes. He was carrying the key to transforming human biology itself, and there were people who would kill anyone and everyone to possess that key. "Harold," Jake said quietly, "I understand now why you were willing to disappear to protect him. Do you also understand why I was hoping someone like you would be willing to fight for him?" Jake studied the evidence of corruption and conspiracy spread across the table, then looked at the people who had chosen to trust him with the truth. Zara, who had risked her career to help. Pete, who had risked his safety to share Harold's secrets. Dr. Santos, who was risking federal retaliation to protect historical sites. And Harold, who had given up his entire life to keep Thunder safe. "I understand," Jake said, "and I'm ready to fight." Thunder whinnied softly from outside, as if he'd heard the conversation and approved. Tomorrow, the real federal authorities would arrive. But tonight, Thunder was still in danger from people who operated outside any law except their own greed. Jake settled down to keep watch, knowing that the most dangerous hours were still ahead. At 3:17 a.m., Thunder's behavior changed. The horse had been grazing peacefully, but suddenly his head snapped up and his ears swiveled toward the south. Jake had learned to trust Thunder's instincts, and he immediately woke the others. "Company coming," Jake whispered. They could hear vehicles approaching without headlights, engines running quietly but not quietly enough to fool a combat veteran's ears. Jake counted at least 3 vehicles, moving slowly and carefully along the dirt road that led to the Miller place. "There's a root cellar behind the house," Pete whispered. "Big enough for all of us, and Thunder too if necessary." But as they prepared to hide, Harold grabbed Jake's arm. "Wait, there's something I need to tell you first. Something I should have told you days ago. Harold, this isn't the time. This is exactly the time." Harold pressed a sealed envelope into Jake's hands. "If something happens to me tonight, you need to read this immediately. Don't wait, don't hesitate. Read it and do exactly what it says." Jake tucked the envelope into his jacket pocket as the sound of car doors closing quietly reached them. Through the window, he could see flashlight beams moving toward the house. "Root cellar," Jake decided. "Sarah, get Thunder. Harold, bring the documents." They moved as quietly as possible toward the back of the house, where Pete revealed a hidden entrance to an underground storage area that had probably been used for canning and food preservation decades ago. It was cramped, but large enough for all of them, and Thunder followed Sarah down the rough wooden steps with surprising grace for such a large animal. Above them, they could hear boots on the farmhouse floor and voices speaking in low, professional tones. Thermal imaging shows recent activity, but no current heat signatures in the main structure. Check the outbuildings. "They can't have gone far." Jake recognized Kellerman's voice among the searchers. These weren't local police or even legitimate federal agents. This was a private operation, probably funded by whoever was behind Meridian Development Corporation. In the cramped confines of the root cellar, Harold leaned close to Jake and whispered something that changed everything. "Jake, I'm not Harold Whitman." Jake stared at the old man in the dim light, filtering through cracks in the wooden ceiling. Above them, "My real name is Dr. Robert Chen. I was the lead researcher on Project Methuselah until I discovered what they really intended to do with the genetic research." Sarah's sharp intake of breath in the darkness told Jake that she'd heard Harold's confession. "Chen, Dad." "Hello, Sarah. I've been waiting 15 years to tell you the truth." Jake's mind reeled as the implications hit him. Sarah was Harold's daughter. Dr. Robert Chen had faked his death and assumed Harold Whitman's identity to protect Thunder and the research. The real Harold Whitman died in a car accident the same month I discovered that Prometheus Biotech was planning to use Thunder's genetic material for human experimentation. Without informed consent, Chen continued in a whisper, I bought his identity, his ranch, and his life to keep Thunder safe. Dad, why didn't you tell me? Sarah's voice was filled with 15 years of pain and confusion, because the people hunting this research killed anyone who knew the truth. I thought you were safer believing I was dead. Above them, the searchers were moving systematically through the house. Jake could hear furniture being moved and floorboards creaking under the weight of multiple people. Dr. Chen, Jake whispered, using the man's real name for the first time. What's in that letter you gave me? Instructions for completing something I've been working on for 15 years. A way to ensure that Thunder's genetic legacy is used for healing instead of exploitation. Thunder was remarkably calm, despite the cramped quarters and the tension radiating from the humans around him. The horse seemed to understand that silence was crucial, and he remained perfectly still, except for the gentle movement of his breathing. There's more, Chen continued. Thunder isn't just carrying genetic modifications, he's carrying the complete genetic profile of every person who used the underground railroad tunnels beneath the ranch. The genetic material I found in those tunnels wasn't just from random individuals. It was from some of the most remarkable people in American history. Jake felt the weight of history settling around them like a physical presence. Thunder carried the genetic legacy of heroes, people who had risked everything for freedom. The letter contains the location of a complete genetic database I've been compiling. If something happens to me, that database needs to reach the right people. Scientists who will use it to help humanity instead of exploiting it for profit. The voices above them were getting closer to the back of the house. It would only be a matter of minutes before they discovered the root cellar entrance. Dad, Sarah whispered, we're going to get out of this. All of us. Chen smiled in the darkness. And for the first time since Jake had met him, the old man looked truly peaceful. I know, because Thunder chose the right person to trust. The footsteps above stopped directly over their hiding place. Thermal imaging is picking up something under the house, a voice called out. Found them, Gellerman's voice replied with satisfaction. Jake's hand moved to the letter in his pocket as the sound of boots approached the root cellar entrance. Whatever happened next, he now understood that he wasn't just protecting a horse. He was protecting the genetic legacy of American heroes and the future of genetic medicine itself. Thunder pressed his massive head against Jake's shoulder, as if offering comfort and strength for whatever was coming. The battle for Thunder's future was about to reach its climax. The root cellar entrance burst open, and flashlight beams cut through the darkness like laser sights. Jake instinctively moved to shield Thunder and the others, but the voice that called down wasn't Kellerman's. Dr. Chen. This is Agent Jennifer Walsh, FBI. We need you and your companions to come up slowly with your hands visible. Jake exchanged glances with Chen in the flashlight glare. This could be another deception, or it could be the real federal authorities Dr. Santos had contacted. How do we know you're legitimate? Jake called up. Because Agent Walsh knows about the genetic database, Chen said quietly, relief evident in his voice. That information was only shared with the original FBI investigators who shut down Project Methuselah. They emerged from the root cellar carefully, with Thunder following Sarah with remarkable calm. In the yard around the farmhouse, Jake could see the aftermath of what had obviously been a significant law enforcement operation. Kellerman and his associates were in custody, their vehicles surrounded by legitimate federal agents. Agent Walsh was a woman in her 40s, with the professional demeanor of someone accustomed to complex investigations. She approached Chen with obvious respect. Dr. Chen, we've been looking for you for 3 months. When you disappeared, we thought Prometheus Biotech had eliminated you to prevent testimony about their illegal activities. I disappeared to protect Thunder and the research, Chen replied. I knew they'd never stop hunting him as long as I was visible. And this must be Thunder, Agent Walsh said, studying the magnificent horse with fascination. Dr. Chen, the genetic research you've compiled over the past 15 years is going to revolutionize medical science. But we need it to be handled properly, legally and ethically. Chen reached into his jacket and pulled out a manila envelope. "This is my will and testament, along with transfer documents for Thunder and all research materials. I'm leaving everything to Jake Morrison, with the stipulation that Thunder's genetic legacy be used only for legitimate medical research that benefits humanity." Jake stared at the documents Chen was placing in his hands. "Dr. Chen, I can't accept this. You can and you will. Thunder chose you, and I trust his judgment more than my own." Chen's voice carried the weight of a man who had made peace with a difficult decision. "Besides, you've already proven you'll protect him regardless of the cost." Agent Walsh examined the transfer documents. "These appear to be in order, but Dr. Chen, you understand that Thunder represents one of the most significant genetic research breakthroughs in modern science. The responsibility is enormous, which is why Thunder needs to belong to someone who sees him as more than a research asset," Chen replied. "Jake understands that Thunder is a living being who deserves respect and care, not just scientific exploitation." Sarah stepped forward, and Jake could see tears in her eyes. "Dad, what happens now?" "Now I testify against everyone involved in the illegal research, and I help legitimate scientists understand how to use Thunder's genetic gifts responsibly." Chen smiled at his daughter. "And now I get to be a father again, instead of a ghost." Agent Walsh gestured toward the federal vehicles. "Dr. Chen will need extensive debriefing about Project Methuselah and Prometheus Biotech's activities. This is going to be a major federal case. I have 15 years of documentation ready for you," Chen replied. "Every illegal activity, every ethical violation, every person involved in the conspiracy." Jake studied the transfer documents in his hands. According to the legal paperwork, he now owned Thunder, the ranch, and all associated research materials. But more than that, he was now responsible for ensuring that Thunder's genetic legacy was used to help humanity rather than exploit it. Thunder moved closer to Jake and nudged his shoulder gently, as if sensing the weight of what had just transpired. "There's one more thing," Chen said, reaching into his pocket and pulling out what appeared to be a brass key. "This opens a safety deposit box at the First National Bank in town. Inside that box is the complete genetic database I've been compiling, along with detailed instructions for ethical research applications." Agent Walsh accepted the key. "Dr. Chen, this research could lead to treatments for aging, cancer, genetic diseases. The implications are staggering, which is exactly why it needs to be handled by people who understand that scientific knowledge is a responsibility, not just an opportunity for profit." Jake looked around at the faces of the people who had risked everything to protect Thunder and the secrets he carried. Sarah, who had helped despite not knowing her father's true identity. Pete, who had trusted them with local knowledge and support. Dr. Santos, who had used her authority to protect historical sites. Agent Walsh, who represented the possibility of legitimate, ethical research. And Thunder himself, the magnificent horse, who had somehow chosen Jake as his protector and had trusted him enough to lead him through the most dangerous week of both their lives. "Agent Walsh," Jake said, "I want to make something clear. Thunder's genetics can be studied, and the research can be used to help people. But Thunder himself is not laboratory equipment. He's a living being who deserves a good life. Understood, Mr. Morrison? The FBI's interest is in prosecuting the people who committed crimes, not in confiscating research animals." Thunder whinnied softly, as if expressing approval of the arrangement. Jake realized that his 50-cent gamble had resulted in something he'd never expected. Not just property ownership, but stewardship of scientific knowledge that could benefit all of humanity. The sun was beginning to rise, painting the sky with colors that reminded Jake of Thunder's coat in the early morning light. 2 weeks later, Jake stood in the barn that had started this entire journey, watching Thunder graze peacefully in the pasture. The legal proceedings were ongoing, but the immediate danger had passed. Kellerman and his associates were facing federal charges for conspiracy, fraud, and attempted theft of government research assets. Dr. Chen had been busy providing testimony to federal investigators, and the evidence he'd compiled over 15 years was proving invaluable in dismantling the network of corruption that had surrounded Project Methuselah. The safety deposit box contained more than just genetic research, Sarah told Jake as she finished Thunder's morning examination. Dad had been documenting every illegal activity related to the project for over a decade. Jake had seen some of the evidence during FBI briefings. Financial records showing how Prometheus Biotech had been diverting federal research funds for private genetic experiments. Communications proving that county officials had been bribed to suppress the ranch's historical designation. Even recordings of conversations between Kellerman and his superiors discussing methods for eliminating problematic witnesses. "Your father was more than a scientist," Jake observed. "He was building a case that would hold up in federal court. He always said that good science required good documentation." Sarah's smile was tinged with pride and lingering sadness for the 15 years they'd lost. Even when he was supposed to be Harold Whitman, he couldn't stop being Dr. Robert Chen. Thunder had adapted to his new legal status with characteristic grace. He seemed to understand that the constant tension and danger had passed, but he remained alert and protective whenever strangers visited the ranch. Agent Walsh had become a regular visitor as the federal investigation expanded. "Dr. Chen's evidence has led us to corruption networks in 3 states, she told Jake during her latest visit. "This case is going to result in the largest prosecution of research fraud in federal history." But with the prosecutions came new challenges. The legitimate scientific community had learned about Thunder's genetic research, and Jake was fielding requests from universities, pharmaceutical companies, and research institutions around the world. "The key," Dr. Chen had told him, "is to ensure that any research is conducted with Thunder's welfare as the primary concern, and with the understanding that genetic medicine should benefit everyone, not just the wealthy." Jake had hired lawyers, specializing in research ethics, to help navigate the complex legal and moral questions surrounding Thunder's unique genetics. Every research proposal was evaluated not just for scientific merit, but for ethical implications and potential benefits to humanity. "There's something else we need to discuss," Agent Walsh said as they walked toward the barn. "The other 2 horses from the original Project Methuselah research." Jake had been wondering about Thunder's genetically modified companions. "What's their status?" "We located them at private facilities controlled by shell companies linked to Prometheus Biotech. Both horses are healthy, but they've been isolated from normal social contact for months." Agent Walsh paused at Thunder's stall. "We need to decide what to do with them." "Bring them here," Jake said without hesitation. "Jake, caring for 3 genetically unique horses is an enormous responsibility. Thunder's been alone for too long. If these horses are his only family, then they belong together." Agent Walsh smiled. "Dr. Chen said you'd respond exactly that way. The logistics will be complex, but we can arrange transport within the month." As if sensing the conversation was about him, Thunder appeared at the pasture fence and called out with a soft whinny. Jake had learned to read the horse's moods and expressions, and Thunder seemed to be expressing approval. "There's one more thing," Agent Walsh continued. "The research database Dr. Chen compiled contains genetic profiles from over 200 individuals who used the Underground Railroad tunnels. With modern DNA analysis, we might be able to identify descendants of those historical figures." Jake understood the implications immediately. People whose ancestors risked everything for freedom could learn about their heritage. Exactly. And some of those genetic profiles show the same longevity markers that Thunder carries. There might be people alive today who have natural versions of the genetic modifications that make Thunder special. Jake looked out at Thunder, who was watching their conversation with intelligent eyes. The horse had become more than a genetic research subject. He was a bridge between past and future, carrying the legacy of American heroes into an era when that legacy could help heal the world. Agent Walsh, whatever research we approve needs to include outreach to communities whose ancestors might be represented in that genetic database. They have a right to know about their heritage and to benefit from any medical breakthroughs that result from their ancestors' genetic contributions. Dr. Chen predicted you'd say that too. Agent Walsh pulled out a thick folder. He's already drafted proposals for community outreach programs and educational initiatives. The man thinks of everything. Jake accepted the folder, knowing it represented months of additional planning and responsibility. But as he looked at Thunder peacefully grazing in the morning sunlight, he felt a deep sense of purpose that he hadn't experienced since his military service. He was protecting more than a horse. He was stewarding a legacy that could benefit generations of people while honoring the memory of those who had died fighting for freedom. Thunder lifted his head and looked directly at Jake, as if sensing the weight of the moment. Then the magnificent horse tossed his mane and returned to his grazing, confident that his future was in good hands. The preparation for the final confrontation with those who would exploit Thunder's legacy was complete. Now it was time to ensure that legacy lived on in the right way. 6 months after that first day, when Jake had pushed open the barn door, he found himself standing in a federal courtroom in Denver, watching as the final pieces of the Prometheus biotech conspiracy were brought to justice. Kellerman sat at the defendant's table, his confident demeanor replaced by the hollow look of a man facing decades in federal prison. Dr. Chen had spent 3 days on the witness stand, methodically presenting 15 years of evidence, financial records, recorded conversations, documentation of illegal experiments, and proof of a conspiracy that reached into corporate boardrooms and government offices. The genetic research represented by Thunder and his companions, Dr. Chen testified, was never intended to be proprietary technology controlled by private corporations. It was meant to be a gift to humanity, derived from the genetic legacy of people who died fighting for freedom. Jake sat in the gallery with Sarah and Pete, watching justice unfold with the deliberate precision of a federal prosecution that had been building for months. Agent Walsh had warned him that this final court appearance might draw unwanted attention from others who coveted Thunder's genetic secrets. She was right. As they left the courthouse after Kellerman's conviction on all counts, Jake noticed the men in expensive suits watching from across the street. Different faces than Kellerman's people, but the same predatory interest in their eyes. "Dr. Chen," one of them called out as they reached the courthouse steps, "I'm representing international pharmaceutical interests who would like to discuss licensing opportunities for the Project Methuselah research." Dr. Chen didn't even slow down. "The research is not available for licensing. It's being donated to public medical institutions for the benefit of all humanity." "Dr. Chen, I think you misunderstand the commercial value of what you've developed." Jake stepped between the pharmaceutical representative and Dr. Chen. "I think you misunderstand who owns the research now." The man studied Jake with the calculating gaze of someone accustomed to getting what he wanted through intimidation or financial pressure. "Mr. Morrison, my clients are prepared to offer substantial compensation for access to the genetic data. And I'm prepared to tell your clients the same thing Dr. Chen just told you. The research isn't for sale." "Everything is for sale, Mr. Morrison. It's just a matter of finding the right price." Jake felt the familiar weight of Thunder's responsibility settling on his shoulders. Even with Kellerman and his conspirators facing prison, there would always be others who saw Thunder's genetics as a path to profit rather than healing. "Agent Walsh," Jake said, noting the FBI agent's presence nearby, "I think these gentlemen need to understand the legal protections that now govern Thunder's genetic research. Agent Walsh approached with the easy confidence of someone backed by federal authority. "Gentlemen, any unauthorized attempts to access or replicate the Project Methuselah research constitute violations of federal law. The genetic data is now under the protection of the National Institutes of Health and will be shared only with approved research institutions." The pharmaceutical representatives exchanged glances, clearly recognizing that their intimidation tactics weren't going to work. But as they walked away, Jake heard one of them speaking into a phone in a language he didn't recognize. "This isn't over," Sarah observed quietly. "No," Dr. Chen agreed. "There will always be people who want to exploit genetic research for profit. That's why Thunder needs protectors who understand that some things are more valuable than money." That evening back at the ranch, Jake found himself in the barn with Thunder and his two companions. The other Project Methuselah horses had arrived a month earlier, and the reunion had been remarkable to witness. Thunder had immediately assumed the role of herd leader, but with a gentleness that spoke to his intelligence and emotional depth. The three horses had bonded quickly, and their presence seemed to have given Thunder a sense of completeness he'd been missing. They grazed together, played together, and protected each other with the loyalty that came from shared experience. "They know they're special," Sarah observed, joining Jake in the barn. "Not because of their genetics, but because of what they represent," Jake nodded. Watching the horses interact with each other and with the small group of legitimate researchers who had been approved to study their genetics. The research was progressing slowly and carefully, with Thunder's welfare always taking priority over scientific curiosity. "Your father's will was very specific about how the research should be conducted," Jake said, pulling out the legal document that had formally transferred ownership to him. "Every study has to be approved by an ethics board, every procedure has to be non-invasive, and the horses have to be treated as partners in the research rather than subjects. Dad always said that good science required good ethics." Sarah smiled as Thunder approached the stall door and nuzzled her hand. "He spent 15 years figuring out how to protect these horses while still allowing their genetics to help humanity." Dr. Chen appeared in the barn doorway, carrying his evening cup of coffee and moving with the easy contentment of a man who no longer had to hide his identity. "The university research proposals look promising," he told Jake. "3 different teams working on applications for age-related diseases, 2 teams studying cellular regeneration for cancer treatment, and 1 team investigating genetic markers for inherited conditions, all approved by the ethics board. All approved and all committed to sharing their findings with the global medical community rather than seeking private patents." Dr. Chen joined them at Thunder's stall. "Thunder's legacy is going to help millions of people, and no one will profit from his genetics except humanity as a whole." Thunder seemed to understand the conversation, pressing his massive head against Jake's chest with gentle affection. The horse had learned to trust not just Jake, but the entire network of people committed to protecting his welfare and his genetic gift. "There's one more thing," Dr. Chen said, pulling out an envelope that looked familiar. "The final element of my will. Something I've been saving for when the legal battles were finished." Jake accepted the envelope, recognizing it as similar to the one Dr. Chen had given him during their escape from the root cellar. "This contains the location of something I've been preparing for 15 years. A foundation that will ensure Thunder and his companions are protected and cared for long after we're all gone." Jake opened the envelope and found documents establishing the Thunder Legacy Foundation, with an endowment that would fund research, care, and protection for the horses indefinitely. "Dr. Chen, this is incredible. But where did the funding come from?" Dr. Chen smiled. 15 years of patent royalties from legitimate genetic research I conducted before Project Methuselah. Money I saved specifically to ensure Thunder's future." Thunder whinnied softly. as if expressing gratitude for the security and protection that had just been formalized. Jake realized that his 50-cent purchase had evolved into something far beyond property ownership. He was now the steward of a foundation dedicated to ethical genetic research and the guardian of horses whose genetics could revolutionize medicine. The final confrontation hadn't been with guns or violence. It had been with lawyers and ethics, boards and careful legal protections that would ensure Thunder's legacy served humanity rather than exploitation. 1 year after Jake had first encountered Thunder in that dimly lit barn, he found himself reading the front page of the Denver Post while sitting on his porch with his morning coffee. The headline read, "Genetic Breakthrough from Underground Railroad Legacy Leads to Cancer Treatment Advances." The article detailed how research conducted with Thunder's genetic material had led to significant progress in understanding cellular regeneration, with early clinical trials showing promise for treating age-related diseases and certain types of cancer. But what made Jake smile was the article's emphasis on the ethical framework that governed the research. The Thunder Legacy Foundation, the article quoted Dr. Chen, represents a new model for genetic research, where scientific advancement serves humanity rather than corporate profits. The horses who carry this remarkable genetic legacy are partners in research, not subjects of exploitation. Sarah appeared on the porch with her own coffee, settling into the chair beside Jake. Dad's been getting calls from research institutions around the world. Everyone wants to understand how the foundation model works, and he's happy to share. Says the whole point is to create a template that other research programs can follow. Sarah smiled as Thunder and his two companions appeared at the pasture fence, as if responding to their conversation. The horses have become ambassadors for ethical science. Jake folded the newspaper and watched the three magnificent animals grazing peacefully in the morning sunlight. Their presence had transformed not just his life, but his understanding of responsibility and stewardship. The university researchers released their first findings yesterday, Sarah continued. Thunder's genetic markers are showing up in DNA tests of people whose families have histories in the Underground Railroad communities. Some of them are carrying natural versions of the longevity genes, which means Thunder's legacy isn't just helping future medical research. It's helping people understand their own heritage and their own genetic gifts. Sarah's expression grew thoughtful. Dad thinks some families might be carrying genetic advantages that could help them live longer, healthier lives. The implications were staggering. Thunder's genetics weren't just laboratory curiosities. They were connecting modern families to their historical roots while providing medical insights that could benefit those same families. "There's something else," Sarah said, pulling out an official-looking letter. "The State Historical Commission wants to designate the ranch as a national historical landmark, not just for the Underground Railroad history, but for its role in advancing ethical genetic research." Jake accepted the letter, reading about plans for educational programs, historical tours, and research facilities that would honor both the past and the future of the property. "They want to build a museum," Jake said, studying the architectural plans included with the letter, a museum and a research center. Visitors could learn about the Underground Railroad history while also understanding how genetic research can be conducted ethically. Sarah pointed to specific sections of the proposal. Thunder and his companions would be ambassadors, helping people understand that scientific advancement and animal welfare can coexist. Thunder chose that moment to approach the fence and call out with a soft whinny, as if expressing approval of the plans being discussed. The National Institutes of Health wants to use the Thunder Legacy Foundation as a model for all genetic research involving animals, Sarah continued. "They're calling it the Thunder Protocol." Jake realized that his 50-cent purchase had inadvertently created a revolution in how genetic research was conducted. The careful ethical framework Dr. Chen had built around Thunder's care was becoming the standard for legitimate scientific institutions. Dr. Chen received another offer yesterday, Sarah said quietly, from a pharmaceutical company in Switzerland. They were offering $200 million for exclusive rights to Thunder's genetic research. What did he tell them? He told them that Thunder's genetics belonged to humanity, not to the highest bidder. Then he hung up on them, Jake laughed, imagining Dr. Chen's polite but firm rejection of what was probably the largest private research offer in history. There's been some media attention, Sarah continued, showing Jake her phone. Thunder has his own social media following now. People from around the world are sending messages of support for the ethical research model. Jake scrolled through messages from families who had traced their ancestry to Underground Railroad participants, from medical researchers who supported the Foundation's approach, and from animal welfare advocates who praised the care Thunder and his companions received. Look at this one, Sarah said, pointing to a message from a young girl in Ohio. Her great-great-grandmother used the Underground Railroad tunnels beneath the ranch. She wants to become a genetic researcher when she grows up, specifically to work with the Thunder Legacy Foundation. Jake felt the weight of inspiration and responsibility that came with understanding how many lives Thunder's story was touching. This wasn't just about one horse or one research program. It was about creating a better model for how science could serve humanity. Thunder appeared at the fence again, this time accompanied by his two companions. The three horses stood side by side, looking out at the ranch that had become their sanctuary and their platform for changing the world. Agent Walsh called this morning, Sarah said. The final Prometheus biotech conspirators were sentenced yesterday. 20-year federal prison terms for conspiracy, fraud, and attempted theft of research assets. Jake nodded, feeling a sense of closure about the immediate threats that had once seemed overwhelming. But he also understood that there would always be new challenges as Thunder's genetic legacy continued. To advance medical science, the Foundation Board meets next week to approve the next round of research proposals, Jake said. Dr. Chen says we have applications from institutions in 12 countries, all committed to the Thunder Protocol, all committed to ethical research that benefits everyone, not just those who can afford to pay for genetic treatments, Thunder whinnied softly. And Jake had the distinct impression that the magnificent horse understood exactly what they were discussing. These animals had become more than research subjects or even beloved companions. They had become symbols of hope for a future where science served all of humanity. The climax of their story hadn't been a dramatic confrontation, but rather the quiet victory of establishing ethical principles that would outlast any of them. 18 months after Jake had bought a ranch for 50 cents, he found himself standing in Thunder's pasture on a crisp autumn morning, holding a small velvet box and trying to gather the courage for a conversation he'd been planning for weeks. Sarah was checking on Thunder's companions, her movements efficient and gentle as she examined each horse with the practiced care of someone who truly understood these remarkable animals. The morning light caught the auburn highlights in her hair, and Jake felt the same sense of peace he'd discovered that first day when Thunder had chosen to trust him. "Sarah," he called out, his voice carrying across the pasture. She looked up from her examination of the youngest of Thunder's companions, a mare whose genetic markers were showing particular promise for cancer research applications. "Everything all right?" Jake walked toward her, the velvet box feeling impossibly heavy in his pocket. Thunder followed him with curious interest, as if sensing that something significant was about to happen. "I've been thinking about the Foundation's 5-year plan," Jake began, then stopped and laughed at himself. "Actually, that's not what I want to talk about." Sarah straightened, giving him her full attention. Behind her, all three horses had gathered, as if they were an audience for whatever was about to unfold. "Sarah, when I bought this place, I thought I was gambling my last 50 cents on a piece of worthless land. I never imagined I'd find a horse who would change everything I understood about responsibility and legacy." Jake pulled out the velvet box. "But I especially never imagined I'd find someone who would make me want to build a future instead of just surviving day to day." Sarah's eyes widened as Jake opened the box to reveal a simple but elegant diamond ring. "The ring belonged to my grandmother," Jake continued. "She and my grandfather worked their farm together for 60 years. They understood that the best partnerships are built on shared purpose and mutual respect." He took a deep breath. "Sarah, will you marry me?" Thunder chose that moment to nudge Jake's shoulder gently, as if offering encouragement. Sarah was quiet for a moment, and Jake could see tears forming in her eyes. "Jake Morrison, are you proposing to me in front of 3 genetically unique horses who are probably going to be in history books someday?" "I thought they should be witnesses," Jake replied. "They're family." "Yes," Sarah said, laughing and crying at the same time. "Yes, absolutely yes." As Jake slipped the ring onto Sarah's finger, Thunder whinnied softly, and his 2 companions joined in as if celebrating the moment. The sound carried across the pasture and seemed to echo off the mountains that surrounded their little valley. "Dr. Chen is going to be so happy," Sarah said, admiring the ring on her hand. "He's been hoping for grandchildren to spoil." "Just grandchildren?" Jake asked with a grin. "Well, maybe great-grandchildren too." Thunder's genetics suggest longevity runs in families associated with this place. They stood together in the pasture, surrounded by horses whose genetic legacy was already helping to heal the world, planning a future that would honor both the past and the promise of tomorrow. The ranch that Jake had bought for 50 cents had given him far more than property. It had given him purpose, family, and a love story that was just beginning. Thunder approached them both, pressing his massive head against their joined hands, as if offering his blessing on their engagement and their future together. 2 years after Jake Morrison had bought a forgotten ranch for 50 cents, he stood before a gathering of hundreds of people who had come to witness the dedication of a bronze plaque that would commemorate the property's remarkable history. The plaque bore a simple inscription: "Thunder Legacy Ranch, where the courage of the past meets the hope of the future." Thunder stood beside him, wearing the silver medallion that had started their journey together, while his 2 companions grazed peacefully nearby. Sarah Morrison, held their 6-month-old daughter, while Dr. Chen shared stories with visiting school children about the Underground Railroad, heroes whose genetic legacy lived on in these magnificent horses. Jake looked out at the crowd of researchers, historians, and families whose ancestors had once sought freedom in these very tunnels. Thunder's genetics had led to breakthrough treatments that were helping thousands of people live longer, healthier lives, while the ethical research model they'd established was being adopted by institutions worldwide. The 50-cent gamble had become a legacy that would benefit humanity for generations to come, proving that sometimes the most valuable things in life can't be measured in money. Thunder nickered softly, as if agreeing, and Jake knew they had found exactly what they'd both been searching for. 2 years after Jake Morrison had pushed open a barn door and discovered a horse that would change his life, he stood before a gathering of nearly 300 people on a perfect spring morning. The bronze plaque being unveiled bore simple but profound words: "In honor of the Thunder legacy, where history, science, and hope unite for humanity." The crowd included representatives from the National Institutes of Health, researchers from universities around the world, descendants of Underground Railroad families, and locals who had watched a 50-cent property purchase transform into something that touched lives across the globe. "When I first met Thunder," Jake said, addressing the gathering from a podium positioned near the barn where it all began, "I thought I was just looking at a horse that someone had abandoned. I had no idea I was looking at a bridge between past and future, between the courage of people who fought for freedom over a century ago and the hope of people fighting for healing today." In the pasture behind him, Thunder and his two companions grazed peacefully, occasionally lifting their heads to observe the ceremony with what seemed like benevolent interest. The three horses had become comfortable with public attention, understanding somehow that their presence brought hope to the people who came to visit. Dr. Chen stepped forward to join Jake at the podium. The Thunder Legacy Foundation has now partnered with research institutions in 23 countries. The ethical protocols developed here have been adopted by major universities and medical centers worldwide. But perhaps most importantly, genetic research conducted with Thunder's willing participation has led to breakthrough treatments for 3 types of age-related diseases. Sarah, now wearing both her engagement ring and a wedding band that matched Jake's, stood near the horses with a group of children who had come to learn about the Underground Railroad history of the ranch. Some of the children were descendants of people who had used these very tunnels to escape slavery, their genetic markers showing connections to the same longevity factors that made Thunder special. The museum and research center will open next month, Dr. Chen continued. Visitors will be able to learn about the Underground Railroad's history while understanding how ethical genetic research is conducted. Thunder and his companions will continue to serve as ambassadors for both historical preservation and scientific advancement. Jake looked out at the faces in the crowd and saw something he hadn't expected when this journey began. He saw hope, researchers excited about conducting science that helped everyone. Families reconnecting with their heritage, children dreaming about careers that would serve humanity. But today isn't just about celebrating what we've accomplished, Jake said, resuming his speech. It's about acknowledging what Thunder taught all of us, that some things are worth more than money, that trust, once given, creates responsibilities that last a lifetime, and that the best investments we can make are in each other's welfare and in the future of people we'll never meet. Thunder chose that moment to approach the fence nearest the ceremony, as if he wanted to be part of the formal recognition. The magnificent horse stood calmly, while photographers captured images that would appear in newspapers and scientific journals around the world. Pete Kowalski, now serving as the ranch's official historian, unveiled a second plaque near the tunnel entrance. This one honored the memory of the people who had used the Underground Railroad, acknowledging that their genetic legacy continued to serve freedom and healing in ways they could never have imagined. The genetic database compiled from the historical materials found in these tunnels has connected over 400 modern families to their Underground Railroad ancestry, Pete announced. Some of those families are represented here today, living proof that courage and hope can echo across generations. Agent Walsh, representing the federal government's ongoing support for the Foundation's work, presented Jake with official documents designating the ranch as a national historical landmark and a federally protected research site. The Thunder Protocol has become the gold standard for ethical genetic research involving animals, Agent Walsh said. This ranch represents proof that scientific advancement and animal welfare are not competing interests, but complementary goals. As the ceremony concluded and people began touring the ranch and meeting Thunder and his companions, Jake found himself standing alone for a moment near the bronze plaque. The words seemed to capture everything this journey had taught him about responsibility, legacy, and the unexpected ways that life could change direction. Sarah joined him, slipping her hand into his as they watched visitors interacting with the horses who had started it all. "Any regrets about spending that 50 cents?" she asked with a smile. Jake looked at Thunder, who was patiently allowing children to pet his neck while their parents took pictures. He thought about the medical breakthroughs that had emerged from ethical research, the families who had reconnected with their heritage, the ethical frameworks that would guide genetic research for generations. "Best investment I ever made," Jake replied. "Thunder taught me that sometimes the most valuable things in life choose you, and then it's your job to prove worthy of that choice." Thunder lifted his head and looked directly at Jake, and in the horse's intelligent eyes, Jake saw something that looked remarkably like approval and contentment. The story that had begun with a desperate gamble had become a legacy of hope, proving that sometimes 50 cents and an open heart were enough to change the world. In the distance, the mountains stood eternal and peaceful, watching over a ranch where history and hope had found a way to serve each other, and where 3 remarkable horses continued to carry the genetic dreams of heroes into a future bright with possibility.